right. Good morning, everyone. Let me get set up. I don't even have as big of a screen as Rick does, so everything's just compressed on my screen as well. So, I remember as a kid, one of the games we would play at night would be torch tag. I don't know if you guys have ever played that game before. It's kind of like a cross between hide and seek and sardines and tag. So the way you would play is you're in a dark space and one person is and they have a flashlight. And we would always try and find like those cheap plastic ones that took like 3 D-size batteries, but gave out like the smallest amount of light. And if you dropped it, the plastic would crack. So we tried to find the cheapest ones. And then everyone else is trying to hide in the dark and not be tagged by the light. And if you get spotted with the light, then you're out. So the way we played it, though, was in our front yards at night, right? You turn the porch lights off and everyone would go hide in the front yard. And then you would have the one person standing on the sidewalk with their flashlight, kind of scanning the yard, trying to tag you. And the fun was, some part of the fun was you didn't always quite make it to your hiding spot. Like you're trying to climb a tree and then they finished counting and they started searching. And so you weren't necessarily stationary when you were hiding. You find a spot that would work for a little bit, light would pass through and you try and run and get to your spot, right? But I remember the worst part about playing porch tag in the front yard was when a car actually came down our street. Why? Because they have headlights. And so when they drove by, their headlights would light up the entire yard and give everyone away. And so for the person that was it was like the ultimate cheat code, and you would ultimately have to restart the round. And if you lived on a street like mine in Texas, you're bound to have several like massive pickups with those floodlights, right? And like they don't even need to drive down the street. They just need to turn on the street and the whole street would be illuminated, right? And so that would happen like once or twice every single time we would play. We've been going through the Gospel of John, and the theme of light has played a significant role. And one of the things we've seen repeatedly throughout the weeks has been how light always beats the dark. Right? Much like how headlights can take over a game of torch tag, the abundance of light found in Christ leaves the darkness of this world no chance. And this week, the theme of light is once again put front and center in the text we've been given today. And so I hope in our time together, we can hit some more points of reflection with the relationship between light and dark. So we're going to be in John chapter 8. So go ahead, grab your Bible, pull it up on your phones or on your computers. John chapter 8. And as you're turning there, let me go ahead and mention a couple of things first to get us started. First, chapter 8 is a beast of a text. Right, there is so much going on in this one chapter. You could probably teach a whole class on this chapter alone. As I was writing this, I was literally getting confused in terms of, am I adding this in or was I deciding to leave this out? Because there is so much going on. All that to say, we're going to walk through the entire chapter, but we're just going to hit highlights this morning. We're really not going to dive as deep as I would like to do this chapter justice, right? We'd probably need several weeks to do that. But yeah, we're just going to get some highlights. Second, normally, I would set up this chapter with what's happening. I would give you some context of what's going on in the background and to help you understand it more. But I feel like I need to address this question first. Right, and Rick and I were talking about this as I was preparing. In most of your translations of the Bible, there is a note that says something along the lines of the earliest manuscripts do not contain the first 11 verses of chapter 8, right? The story of the woman caught in adultery. And this may come as a surprise to some of you. I know it came as a surprise to Rick, because if you have been around the Bible, or even if you haven't, right, you most likely have heard this story before, right? It's a very well-loved story, and many of you have learned about Jesus' grace, his mercy, his compassion through this story alone. But it isn't included in the earliest manuscripts that we have of the Gospel of John. So what you need to know is this story, amongst scholars, amongst historians, amongst those who study the original language, this story, this section of text, has always been up for debate, like for years and years and years, right? They've debated about where it came from, why is it included, right? The good news is, though, there does seem to be a general consensus around a few things. One, there's a general consensus that this story was not originally part of the Gospel of John, and it doesn't seem to be written by him. The word choice, the writing style is different. It seems to actually make the narrative a little clunkier. So in fact, if you take out this whole story and you read from the end of chapter 7 and begin in John 12, the narrative actually seems to flow better. Jesus isn't walking from here to there and then back again, right? And so the narrative flows better. And so when you hear this and you hear like it wasn't originally included in the earliest manuscripts, as I was preparing, like the first question is, well, should we just throw this story out? Like, should we ignore it? And the answer to that, and I think many, the commentaries I read and scholars and things like that would propose is no, not necessarily. Because even though it wasn't original to the text, scholars generally seem to agree that this is an event that actually did happen, right? There's tons of things Jesus did and taught that weren't recorded in scripture, but it doesn't mean they didn't happen. And perhaps, more importantly, even though it wasn't originally part of the text, it doesn't seem to deviate from the overall gospel message of John, and for that matter, the Bible. It doesn't portray Jesus as anything different than what we're already being told about him. In fact, it actually helps support and strengthen who we know Jesus to be and what he has done. It's in line with what we know of the Pharisees and their interactions with Jesus. And so the inclusion of the story doesn't lead us down any stray paths with the gospel message. And then, if you're still on the fence about what to do with this passage, some scholars will also point out that the insertion of this story actually helps fit the pattern we see in John in the way that he writes. That Jesus normally does something, and then after he does something, he'll teach about it, or there'll be some sort of conversation and dialogue, right? So he turns water to wine, he clears the temple, and then he's teaching Nicodemus. He's asking the woman at the well for water, and then he's teaching and talking about living water. He heals people, he's teaching about where his authority comes from. He feeds the 5,000 and walks on water, and then he's proclaiming he's the bread of life, and that you'll never go thirsty again. And so if you leave this story out and you end at chapter 7 and begin at verse 12 of chapter 8, it's just more teaching. It's more dialogue, it's more teaching. There's no event that precedes it. So structurally, it helps keep form as well. So wherever you may be with this story, those are some things to consider. For this morning, however, what I want to do is go through this story very quickly and hopefully show that even though it doesn't fit the narrative neatly, thematically, it fits really well, right? There are certain themes of light and dark that connect with what Jesus teaches in the rest of the chapter. And so hopefully I can show that to you with the rest of our time. So we're going to begin John chapter 8, starting in verse 2. And this is what it says. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught uh, in the act of adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say? This they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. And once more, he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? She said, no one, Lord. And Jesus said, neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more. And so what I want to draw our attention to is the darkness that hangs over this story. And I think most of us will remember this story in the Bible because of the brilliance of Jesus' answer and the tenderness and grace Jesus uses to interact with this woman. And this is an important takeaway from the story, arguably the most important takeaway. However, what makes our understanding of Jesus so memorable is that it's contrasted with the darkness and heaviness of what is actually happening in this story, right? The flip side of this story is that it's really a tale of two sinners. You have the more obvious sinner, the woman with her sexual infidelity, her adultery, and then you have the scribes and the Pharisees, and they're not so obvious sin, right? They're religious sinners. Their self-righteousness and pride has taken them down a path where they are scheming and plotting the execution, the murder of Jesus. And so their scheming and plotting brings them to this point where they are yet again trying to trap Jesus. They know Jesus is a man of mercy. He's been teaching about never thirsting again, about being the bread of life, of these life-giving things. He's trying to give life, not take it away. But when confronted with this situation, if he preaches mercy, he's going directly against the law, against Torah, against the authority of Moses, which would give them all the evidence they need to go against him. And yet, if he agrees to their accusations, if he sides with the law, what he's been teaching, his reputation, all of that would be contradicted. It would be tarnished. And worse yet, this woman will die. So by the way, right, the law of Moses that the scribes and Pharisees are referring to comes from Leviticus 20:10, which states that it's both the man and the woman who are to be punished for their adultery. And yet this passage makes no mention of the man. The scribes and Pharisees only need the woman for their purposes. They're using her for their agenda, which is to catch Jesus. And that should just highlight just some of the depth and darkness of their own sin. They're literally using other people with a complete disregard for that person's dignity and worth. And it's an illustration of how sinners treat other sinners harshly, as well as how the law treats sinners harshly as well. And the Apostle Paul, he talks about this harshness as he is teaching the gospel in Romans 3:20. Let me see here. Do I have this? Right. So, for by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. In the law, there's no mercy, there's no grace. It's all about what are the consequences of the action, right? The way things are set up. It's a very dark and grim reality. There's no hope in the law itself. And you contrast this with Romans 8, where there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the Spirit of life has set you free in Christ Jesus from the law of sin and death. And this is literally what Paul's writing here in Romans 8 is literally what we see happening in the story. Salvation comes through Jesus. Right? So if you try and imagine what this moment for the woman is like, right? Like at that moment where your darkest and deepest sin is exposed. And not just exposed, but exposed in a way where everyone knows. Right? Just think about that moment and the amount of shame and embarrassment and how terrified she would have been, horrified she would have been. Like that feeling that the sky is falling down, the world is caving in. Like how overwhelmed with the flood of all of that she must be when confronted with her own sin, with her own darkness, in just the most brutal and unloving way possible. And I imagine, given the context of everything, there's another thought she would have had that in our day and age wouldn't even cross our minds. And that is, am I going to die? Right? This woman is most likely experiencing the fullness of the sin and darkness in her life and has nothing but her despair, because this could literally be all there is, right? Her life is on the line at this moment. She could die. And it's in that moment that Jesus is able to give his answer, right? Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. Right? It's an answer that treats her with dignity and equality with her accusers, with tenderness and care, with mercy and grace. And his answer is convicting. Right? We don't know what actually happens to her after this, but we are led to assume Jesus' message softens her heart. That the mercy and forgiveness given to her actually does lead her to a life that is more holy and less sinful. We assume Christ is able to break through to her. But Jesus' message is also convicting to her accusers. Right? They hear Jesus and they leave one by one, starting with the older ones. And it's curious that they mention it's the older ones that leave first. Maybe they've experienced life enough to know that they don't have a leg to stand on here. Right? But the point is, they are driven away by Jesus' response. It doesn't soften their hearts or draw them in. It repels them. They're so consumed by the darkness in their lives, they can't hear the good message that Jesus is bringing every time he opens his mouth. We know this because of how the story turns out, that they continue down their dark path and they get what they want out of their agenda, which is to kill him. And so in this story, you have the darkness of sin and you have two sets of sinners, one that is obvious, another that is not so obvious. And Jesus' response to their sin convicts them in two distinctly different ways. One is drawn towards Jesus, the other is driven away and remains in their darkness. And it's from this story that's been interjected into John's gospel that you continue on to the next section of Jesus' teaching and proclamation. Right? Verse 12. It says, again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, will have the light of life. Jesus is making another one of his great statements of identity. I am the light of the world. And this statement ties into the story just before it, right? He has shown his light on the darkness that covers the scribes and Pharisees. He has shown his light on the darkness of the woman caught in adultery. And now he is proclaiming he is the light of the world. So what does he mean by this? What does Jesus mean by this? Well, this isn't the first time we've seen the theme of light come up in John's gospel. right? If you remember, Rick, where we started in this series, in the first chapter of John, right? John 1, 4 through 5, it says, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And if you remember when Rick was teaching about this, right, the first thing God creates is light, but it's not physical light, right? The sun, the moon, the stars, they come on day 4, right? The first light that God creates comes from his very being, right? That this light is the source of all life, and it is abundant, and it overwhelms the dark that just existed. And in that first chapter of John, when John is writing about this light, there is a transition in that prologue where the light becomes a he, becomes a being, no longer in it, right? And Jesus is now making it known that he is this light. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Jesus, right here, is claiming his divinity. And for the original audience, those listening to Jesus, this would have been an incredibly curious and provocative statement to make. But at the same time, it should have been very clear what he was claiming. And one of the reasons we would know that is because the text says he was speaking in the temple treasury. If you skip ahead to verse 20, it says these words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple. And what's significant about that, right? As Rick described last week, they're in Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, one of the major celebrations of the year, where they commemorate God's care for the Israelites in the wilderness, right? It's a joyful celebration full of music and dance. And with all of these feasts, there would have been rituals and ceremonies. And one of the great ceremonies during the Feast of Tabernacles was called the illumination of the temple. And in this ceremony, each afternoon of the 7 days of the feast, everyone would have gathered in the court of women, which is where the temple treasury was, right? So the green line, I don't know if you guys can see that, the green line is kind of pointing to the treasury, right? And the court in front of it, that's the court of women, right? And in the court now, there would be 4 large oil lamps. Some scholars say they were larger than 65 gallons, right? Like so big oil lamps, and there'd be ladders. You can't really see it in that picture where they would go up and prepare the lights, right? And it was said that these lamps were so bright, they lit up every courtyard in Jerusalem. Like they lit up the whole town. And as they lit up these lamps, the priests and Levites would dance and sing and play instruments to offer their praise. And this would go on throughout the night, right? So they would do this every day. And the lighting ceremony symbolized 2 things. The first was it commemorated God's presence with the Israelites in the wilderness. Remember, Rick taught about the Shekinah, like God's presence, his glory, as another name for Yahweh. And in the wilderness, God's presence with the Israelites came in the form of a cloud, the glory cloud. So during the day, cloud provided shade from the oppressive heat of the wilderness for them. During the night, the cloud appeared as fire, offering light in the darkness and heat from the cold for them. And so first, the light ceremony commemorated God's presence, but it also pointed to the Isaiah prophecy that there would one day be a great light to shine in the darkness, right? The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone, right? So the ceremony marked God's presence as light and the return of that light one day, right? So you imagine this is the day after the feast has ended. And what happens after the party is over? you got to clean up, right? You got to tear down, put everything back where it was. And so you imagine everyone's still in town. They're packing up, getting ready to go back home. And maybe they're working on packing up stuff for these oil lamps. It's like Christmas, taking the lights down on your home, or at least you should. You're not leaving it up for the whole year only to flip them back on when Christmas comes around next year, right? They're actually taking it down, right? And now Jesus starts speaking about being the light of the world, where this ceremony takes place, right? Jesus is claiming his divinity by saying, I am the Shekinah now. I am God in the flesh. I am the great light Isaiah was talking about. You just spent a week celebrating light in the desert, right? Follow me. I will light up your world. And of course, a claim like this will elicit a variety of responses, right? Including those who object, right? And no surprise, the Pharisees quickly chime in with their objection, right? Basing it off of Jewish law that any claim needs 2 to 3 witnesses to be valid, right? They're the first to respond. Jesus makes this claim. They immediately respond with an objection. And again, just like the gospel has been showing us all along, the context is they're still trying to find a way to get Jesus killed, right? They're still caught up in their own darkness. They can't even hear and consider for a moment what Jesus is saying. And so Jesus plays along and responds to their objection by making 3 points, right? Verse 14, right? First, he says, even if I do bear witness about myself, my testimony is true, for I know where I came from and where I am going. But you do not know where I come from or where I am going. And again, here he is claiming his divinity. He's saying, actually, my witness is true because I'm God in the flesh, right? If God is God, then there's no other higher authority that you can appeal to, right? The law is given by God for man, not by man for God. And so what the Pharisees are objecting with, he's saying, it doesn't apply to me, right? I'm God. Jesus is all truth, right? I can't lie. And then second, he says, if you continue on, verse 15, he says, you judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is true. For it is not I alone who judge, but I and the Father who sent me. Right? Jesus is now basically dismissing their objections. He's saying, you're making judgments using yourselves as the authority. And he's saying their thinking is flawed, right? Because they already have biases, they have presuppositions, they have a hidden agenda, and they're looking at someone who doesn't line up with those biases and assumptions and their agenda, and they make a judgment. And Jesus says, I don't do that. And even if I were to make a judgment, it'd be true, because it's not his judgment alone, but it's a judgment made by him, by both himself and the Father. Which brings him to his last point, right? In your law is written that the testimony of 2 people is true. I am the one who bears witness about myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness about me. Like, he's basically saying, oh, and by the way, if you want 2 witnesses, then there's me, and there's my Father. At which point, they reply by asking, where is your Father? Notice they're asking where. They're not asking who is your Father. Where is your Father? Right? What are they thinking with this question? Right? This is an obvious slur. This is an obvious dig, an insult at Jesus. Right? They're asking about Jesus's earthly father. Commentators say, for someone who has stirred up this much controversy in their ranks, captured so much of their attention, they would have done their homework about Jesus. And they would have found out about the circumstances about his birth, right? And they would have been like, a virgin birth? Huh? Like, that doesn't equate, right? And there would have been rumors and accusations about the illegitimacy of Jesus' birth, right? So their question is an insult. They're implying his birth was illegitimate. And again, this is an indication of that downward spiral, of the depths that they're now sinking to in the darkness of their own sin. In fact, if you keep reading later on in the chapter, like in verses 39 through 47, like Jesus calls them out on this. He talks about how they're trying to kill him and how they're doing the will of their own father, the devil, right? He goes all in, right? And by the way, we won't get to this today, but one of the things you should look out for if you ever go back and study this text is how quickly the interaction between Jesus and the Pharisees escalates in this chapter alone, right? I mean, he's calling them children of the devil by the end of the chapter, right? Like it escalates pretty fast, right? And so the rest of this chapter pretty much follows this pattern of back and forth. Jesus makes claims about his identity as the light of the world with greater and greater clarity, and the Pharisees grow bolder, more spiteful, and hateful towards him, more vengeful towards him. And what's interesting, though, is in this passage, their objection is only one of the responses, right? There are other people in the crowd listening to this back and forth. And this is how they respond, right? If you skip down to verse 30, it says, as he was saying these things, many believed in him. So Jesus said to the Judeans who had believed in him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And they answered him, we are offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is that? How is it that you say you will become free? Right? So you have a group of people in verse 30 who hear what Jesus is saying, and they are convicted by it. There's faith in the hearts of many of those listening. They want their lives to be lit up. But then from verse 31 on, it gets a little confusing because it sounds like those that believe Jesus are also the ones that are beginning to doubt him and question him, right? They're like, we've never been enslaved to anyone. Like, what are you talking about, right? And it gets a little confusing. And as you read on, it sounds like they begin to align themselves more and more with the Pharisees. And Jesus pushes back on them with more and more force. So what's going on here? Right? What some commentators say is there is a shift between verse 30 and verse 31. That Jesus is actually talking to two different groups of people. There are the ones in verse 30 who believe in him. If you like to underline, I would underline or circle in him. And then there are those in verse 31 who believe him. In other words, there are those who put their trust and their faith in Jesus after listening to him, and they're all in. And then there are those who are saying, okay, I'll believe you, I'll bite. I'm following what you're saying. Let's see how deep this rabbit hole goes. Which is why now Jesus makes the point to say that if you're going to follow me, hey, be my disciple, right? You have to abide in my word. Abide not only in what I'm saying, but what that means about who I am. If you want your lives to be lit up by the light of the world, come on, right? Abide. Accept me without objection. Accept me without reservation. This is an all-in kind of deal. Come on, abide. Right? You either get lit up and light saturates everything, or you don't. So abide. And the point is if you want this light in your life, it's not going to come through someone or something. It's not going to come through abiding in the law. It's going to come through Jesus, right? Faith in who he is claiming to be, abiding in him, not as rabbi, not as teacher, but as Messiah, as God in the flesh. And the sad thing is, when you read the rest of the chapter, the back and forth continues. And this is how the chapter ends. Jesus said to them in verse 48, Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Right? That phrase, I am, you can underline, there's that connection again, the Moses and the burning bush, and how God pronounces himself to the Israelites as I am. Right? And then it says, so they picked up stones to throw at him. And Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. The sad thing was, they couldn't do it. They couldn't accept Jesus or what he was saying. They considered him blasphemous. They were convicted to not embrace the light, but rather to stay in the dark and to pick up their stones. Which is ironic, is it not? We start the chapter with the Pharisees asking if they should be throwing stones at the woman caught in adultery. And at the end, they're ready to hurl stones at Jesus because their darkness could not embrace the light. So now what? Today is the first Sunday of Advent. And if you're not familiar with Advent, Rick's kind of explained it a little bit before, but it's the season that's practiced by many churches throughout church history, where for the 4 Sundays before Christmas, we take on this posture of expectant waiting and preparation as we remember the arrival of Christ into this world. And what a wonderful blessing it is that we get to talk about this text today on the first Sunday of Advent, right? Because the theme of light plays such a big part of this season. In fact, there are many who believe part of the reason we celebrate Christmas during this time of year is because of its proximity to the winter solstice on the calendar, right? The winter solstice being the shortest day of sunlight in the year. In ancient agrarian societies that relied on the sun without the benefit of modern science telling them and teaching them about the rotations and revolutions around the sun, it would look like to them that the darkness was winning or that the sun was retreating and that maybe the sun god or whatever god they worship had turned their back on them. And so in history books, you read about these winter solstice celebrations where they would pray to the gods to bring back the sun. And so when the early church started to make its way into these regions and societies, right, they would hear this, and it's no surprise that around this season that they would talk about Jesus being the light of the world, whose light would never fade and whose light will always win over the dark, who will light up your life if you would abide in him. For us then, how are you convicted by the light of Christ as we enter into Advent? During arguably one of the craziest and perhaps for some of us darkest years of our lives. Does the light of the world convict you to draw closer, to abide? To hear the call, as Jesus said to the woman, to go and sin no more? Or do you find yourself consumed by the dark, like the Pharisees? That maybe it's clouded your better judgment and you're wanting to put God on trial. Or you're picking up stones like the crowds, ready to write Jesus off. And if that's the case, what are the stones that you're carrying? Maybe you've resolved that it's better to hide in the dark than to have all your mistakes and wrongdoing exposed by the lights. My hope is that you would come to find the light of the world. You would come to find Jesus this Advent in new and brilliant ways. And that just like the woman in the story, even when there is embarrassment, when there is shame and horror, you would find the light to be tender, gentle, compassionate, loving, caring, merciful, and gracious. Because just as Henry Nouwen once wrote, when we keep claiming the light, we find ourselves becoming more and more radiant. And so I hope that in this season, you would find the light of the world.